Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism, and to Delmore Schwartz, Marxism and the Modernist Poet. Before we start, however, I want to clue you into some of the other panels that we have coming down the road. Some of them are live and most of them are online. If you happen to be in Seattle tomorrow night, you can go to the Beacon Cinema and hear Why It Happened Here, which of course is a play on the title of the novel, It Can't Happen Here. And this will have David Shields, the author of Reality Hunger, Tommy Swenson, and myself. On Tuesday at 2 p.m., by the way, and that's 5 p.m. Pacific time. At 2 p.m. on Tuesday, the 20th, The West and the Rest, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World. And that will be discussion with Sandra Mazadra and Brett Nielsen of their new book out from Verso. Kyle Kubler will moderate. On Wednesday, May 21st at 11 a.m. Pacific time, Citizen Marx, Republicanism and the Formation of Marxist Thought. It's a new book by Bruno Leopold. Bruno will be here from London discussing with Michael Hart, Camilla Vergara, and Elisa Battistoni. On Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, American Constitutional Collapse, discussion with Aziz Rana, the author of The Constitutional Bind, and a wonderful article in New Left Review's Sidecar online called Constitutional Collapse, which discusses the first 100 days of Mr. Trump. Michael Hart will also be on that with Camilla Vergara, and I will moderate. And live on the 25th, Sunday the 25th, the week from Sunday, at 5 p.m. Pacific time, Enemy Feminism's Turfs, Police Women and Girl Bosses. That's at Elliott Bay Book Company. And with the inimitable Sophie Lewis, the moderator will be Emi Koyama. So we have lots of stuff coming down the road. What I do want to say is, if you like what we do, please donate. Go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org. And there's a donate button that will lead you either to a GoFundMe or a Patreon if you want to be a patron. We do not get any public money at all, or no money from the federal government, so Trump can't cut us off at any rate. But we do hobble along in our guerrilla fashion, doing it for now 9 years, and we're trying to get a lot of funds together to have a bang-up 10th year celebration for Red May. Okay, let's go to today's panel, and I will introduce you to our panelists. Chris, can we by magic leave my laundry room and produce everybody else on the screen who is lurking in the studio behind the arras, so to speak? Oh, David is the one of the editors of the wonderful magazine Lana Turner. It's not a movie star magazine. It's a poetry magazine, one of the best in the country. To my untutored judgment, it has it's an art work in itself. The magazine, you open it up and you're liable to find the unlikely combination of Joshua Clover, Louis Aragon, and George Lukács. You never know from what era you will find people, and it's really a beautiful magazine. Alan Wald, professor emeritus at the University of Michigan, and a contemporary of mine. We rarely have people of my age. This particular program. Alan is the author of a book called The New York Intellectuals, which of course gives us a background on not only on the people who founded a partisan review, but commentary and so forth, the whole background. But he's the author of a trilogy, and I'm trying to remember all the names. Trinity of Passion is one. Alan, give me the other two. I want to push your trilogy a bit.
Trinity. Well, the first one is Exiles.
One of them has night in the word. The last one.
Yeah. First one is Exiles from a Future Time, about the origins of the communist left. The second one is Trinity of Passion, about the anti-fascist movement. And the third one is American Night, which is about the Cold War impact on the far left.
Right. I can't express what a treasure trove this particular trilogy is in terms of introducing us to writers who we may have known about subliminally or peripherally because we saw a movie of theirs or read some pop culture thing and find out who were active members of the Communist Party. The people that I think about, for example, are Kenneth Fearing, who was a poet, of course, but who I knew as the author of the novel that was made into the movie The Big Clock with Ray Milland and Charles Lawton, an incredible classic noir, which was then remade as an anti-communist film called No Way Out with Kevin Costner in the 80s. Guy Endor, who wrote The Werewolf of Paris. Who would know that was a communist? And, also some wonderful writers that I never knew about, but who can stand up to anyone. I'm thinking of Ruth McKinney, who is known to the American public as the author of My Sister Eileen, which became a movie and a stage play, but has this incredible book about Akron called Industrial Valley, which I highly recommend to anyone. Michael Londra just dropped in on us today, a poet from New York who has written about Delmore, and we love it when people surprise us. And at some point, Roy Skodnick, my classmate at Columbia in '68, who knew some of the people in Partisan Review because they, of course, were in the English department at Columbia. And Roy is the editor of All Area magazine and has just written a biography of the sculptor James Metcalf and Santa Clara del Cobre in Mexico. So we've got a lot of good stuff, and I think we'll start with David Lau to tell us something about Delmore Schwartz.
Okay, so I'll be reading, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. I'll be reading a section of an essay I wrote that basically covers his recently published collected poems. And that'll be followed by a longer presentation by Alan, and then Philip will speak finally, and then we'll have Michael Londra as our discussant, who's been able to join us here, and that's a real bonus. So this is my take on the recently published Delmore Schwartz collected. Like the statue of Glaucus, submerged in the oceans of extreme 20th century time and encrusted with the views of poets, writers, biographers, friends, Delmore Schwartz is difficult to discern as he was. Selection and republication of his works reinforce a highly partial, disfiguring reconstruction of this obscure poet. A recent selection from New Directions, Once and For All, is a case in point. Its version of his poetry is a concoction of short lyrics. John Ashbery introduces his Delmore, whose early works, manifold forms, so marked Ashbery, by placing some emphasis on Delmore's neglected later poetry, which emerged when he was already forgotten or dismissed as a writer and intellectual. Editor Craig Morgan Tyker selects some few Delmore lyrics and some famous prose stories for a collection that conforms to the dire state of inoffensive contemporary poetry, and no one from New Directions, with its extremely literate staff, thought to intervene. The earlier selection, Summer Knowledge, never did convey to me what Robert Lowell, John Berryman, and others saw in Delmore, as he was always called. Those of us who knew the work had to resurrect it ourselves in university libraries, where one could find the collections formed by this singular writer, whose output had notable peaks and depressing valleys, but whose geography is only today being accurately mapped. How welcome, then, is Ben Mazur's editorial work on the long-awaited edition of the collected poems of Delmore Schwartz. After Mazur's guarded introduction, which reproduces the scholarly consensus view of modernist, depoliticized Delmore, bequeathed to us by James Atlas and Dwight MacDonald, the first section of the book immediately brings Schwartz to life. He had to survive poor selections of his work, which should be read as whole as possible, all overwrought things considered. Delmore's style, how Miltonic, with disobedient fruits of reiteration, hyperbaton, internal and rhythm rhymes. Poems here fight the modernist prescription of the ornate, the florid, the pulsing, and metronomic. From the first moment of the collected, one must brace oneself for novel forms. His earliest poetry exhibits a virtuosic etude dimension. He was just 25 when it was published at the end of the Red Decade in 1938. As with his restaging of Shakespeare, Coriolanus and His Mother, The Dream of One Performance, for an audience of Marx, Aristotle, and Beethoven, containing many passages of self-description, with Coriolanus his first of many personas or twins. Ambition is too small a word for the young Delmore. Deftly taking in the modernists, he wound up almost devoid of direct traces of Eliot or Pound. His poetry, continuous, sonically consonant, is the good times of writing, ebullient stuff, invented by ear and philosophical musing. The style is American, a la Whitman or William Carlos Williams, but teething on philosophy, long sentences, a passion for the new, with a red shading of Bolshevism. Something of the conversationalist James Atlas chronicled in his biography of Delmore emerges in this collected. Against truncation, Delmore's loose, even gabby, anticipatory confessionalism possesses bright tinges despite the overriding. He was Miltonic too, in that his critical sensibility was close to T.E. Hulme, a classicist whose canon was the emergent modernism. Miltonic too, in that he was a revolutionist who required painstaking reading, explanation, while striving to be the absolute writer. He would attempt all this, seeking to supplant Pound as village explainer, even succeeding for a time. His poetry bears the strong mark of a Lukácsian realism, yet is open to the psychoanalytic asubjective for which Lukács was mere speculation. In these ways, as Alan Wald notes, one of the panelists today in his essay and talk that he'll talk about in a moment, in these ways, as Alan Wald notes, Delmore is in close proximity to the classically unorthodox Western Marxism. If any poem from the early Delmore illustrates this, it is his derivation of Plato in the naked bed in Plato's cave, which seems to anticipate Lacan's dictum that the real is Baltimore in the morning. But in this case, it's New York's defamiliarized objectivity after sleeplessness. The second of two unrhymed sonnets begins, strangeness grew in the motionless air, the loose film grayed. A measure of abstraction and narrative crescendo in the final passage. In dream begins a responsibility to the waking day. Delmore never escapes the cave. There is no utopian solution, only political, i.e. class struggle, set to fail better, as Humboldt Delmore does in Saul Bellow's novel of the poet, Humboldt's Gift. And yet his often ironic lyrics, the Ballad of the Children of the Tsar, Saint Revolutionist, concerning the synthetic unity of apperception, especially the early ones, do triumph, in part because they borrow from aspects of Pound's traffic with the ancients. A break with tradition is never total and must be drawn from a strong engagement with it, its rediscovery. Which Delmore? James Atlas's biography carefully built out Delmore as a non-Marxist, as Alan Wald notes in a recent path-breaking essay, whereas for Wald, Delmore was thoroughly a leftist, spurred on by the springtime of 1920s Bolshevism. Wald, quote, "There should be no haziness as to where Delmore's convictions lay in the Red Decade," end quote. A left poet and critic from a prosperous, then declassed and broken home, Jewish, but against the particularism of that religion, on the periphery of the Communist Party, Delmore was attracted to Trotskyism. central to the early reformation of the Partisan Review, which he contributed to before later editing it. In Wald's account, his early work remains the touchstone it was for a generation, while Delmore's politics is a face to the point of enigma. Wald laments the, quote, fast food approach to his political ideology, end quote. Against Atlas's interpretation, anti-communism, emphasized in relation to the post-war Partisan Review, meant anti-Stalinism. Delmore's politics were peace and liberty-oriented workers' movement in principle, until the Trotskyist left faded from view. In his heyday, he was aligned with the last of the old Bolsheviks, an alignment consistent with the reborn Partisan Review, whose 1938 editorial could not be clearer. Our program is a program of Marxism, which meant the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and militarism in opposition to bourgeois democracy, fascism, and reformism. For Wald, the closest literary cousin here is Walter Benjamin. Atlas fumbled by giving his biography manuscript to Dwight MacDonald to edit out any reference to Delmore's political commitment, including his signatures on statements from the League for Cultural Freedom and Socialism, a group aligned with the Breton Trotsky Rivera Groupuscule, the International Federation of Revolutionary Art. He appeared in the Social Poets number of poetry, prepared by New Mass's contributing editor Horace Gregory. For Delmore, only a socialist transformation could halt a rising fascism birthed by capitalism in crisis. Partisan Review opposed U.S. entry into the Second World War on left pacifist grounds. War as a racket spirit lay behind Delmore's harsh rebuke of Muriel Rukeyser's poetry in support of the Allies during the war. Anti-war politics made concrete his and others' partisanship. These Marxist commitments, which were literary and intellectual, are clearly articulated in his long and incomplete poem, Genesis, which awaits proper reception. Wald's political analysis of Delmore contains sensitive comment on a number of Delmore's shorter lyrics, yet Genesis is largely dismissed as in everything you wanted to know about Delmore's childhood affair. In my reading, Genesis is the heart of the collected. Like the lengthy early poems, it has the vitality of Delmore's far-seen and well-staged works. One must encounter them whole to get the meaning of Alan Tate's 1930s notion that Delmore had given American poetry its first novelty since Pound and Eliot. Genesis, like Coriolanus and his mother, combines poetry and prose, elements of verse and drama, and recitative narration. Poetry and prose work as blazing counterpoint to one another. They articulate an alienating distance. Today's ubiquitous personal poets write a warm bath of themselves. Delmore, by contrast, writes a defamiliarized personal poem about a doppelganger, Hershey Green, and his extended family, welded from historical materialism's twin law-based orders of capital and interstate system, both evolving under dialectical pressure. Early on, a ghost speaks in the choral verse section. Quotations appear in the original poem. It is composed of manifold voices. One can see how unfashionable his work would become in creative writing America with its injunctions to show and not tell. Like Brecht, Delmore enlivens the great method of historical materialism with creative expression. I'll quote from him: giant, phenomenal, and purposeless, how the divinities, America, Europe, capitalismus, others too, move through the life of this Atlantic Jew. Regard Genesis at almost every point, and one finds something similar. We are worlds away from Plath, Lowell, or Berryman in the long poem's explanatory anti-lyric confines. In broad outline, it depicts the migration of the Green family to New York, where, after a generation, Hershey, Delmore Standen, is the son of a real estate petty bourgeois father. Genesis presents its people in the legacy of uneven socioeconomic development. Pre-capitalist, capitalist, and semi-capitalist formations colored the experience of new immigrants to early 20th century America. These were the Green's customers who gave life to the Green real estate business. In part due to the property relations of the old country, the new migrants were fixated on land. Fictional Green's fathers, like Delmore's, fortune tracked those of the working classes as they bought or sold, depending on the movement of markets. In 1929, the wipeout came, and with it, a still not well understood depression. Subject position shift, now the psychoanalytic scene of a family torn apart by economic success and collapse. A child is reared in a world of war capitalism, but also in the jealous and angry, stormy conditions of his parents' many separations before final divorce. After the war, beginning in 1946 and accelerating after accepting money from a CIA front group, Partisan Review lost its way. Editors advocated for hardening treatment of the Soviet Union while calling liberals who opposed the Cold War a fifth column. It would be easy to say the old Bolshevik, the Trotsky-influenced Delmore became an anti-communist, the scholarly consensus. Wald instead points to Delmore's post-war review essay on Sidney Hook, which defends Lenin against Hook's calumny that the Bolshevik Revolution bore responsibility for economic crisis and the rise of fascism. As with Genesis, Delmore names the real causes, the crises of capitalism and the industrial war machines developed for inter-imperial conflict. Delmore never reconciled himself to a society that devalues advanced literary and artistic activity then or now. True, he became an anti-communist, yet he remained an anti-capitalist. It is still too easy to reduce him to his tail end as a State Department socialist. It remains difficult to explain the rapid transformations of politicized writers in the interwar years and thereafter, which are not clearly visible from today's anarchist subject position of the far left. Delmore's down and out years after the war and early tragic deaths speak to the disappearance of the red decade that generated his literary career. And then I just wanted to go to my conclusion and say that Delmore needs the interwar context to be understood. If we shear away his Hegelian historical truth content, so to speak, his poetry is read partially and selected poorly. His forgotten anthology piece, The Ballad of the Children of the Tsar, is in danger of losing most of its irony over these reactionary decades. The children play with a bouncing ball while section 1 concludes, like Papa's face, said sister, hurling the whole ball forth, conveying the looming revolutionary tumult and overthrow of Tsarism in hilarious understatement. While I ate a baked potato 6,000 miles apart gives the terse montage technique its edgy ridiculousness, a feeling to be found in abundance in Delmore's Collected. Indeed, if it weren't for the overt cynicism of his revolutionary aplomb, I'm not sure why his poetry would remain interesting. In his finest poems, the long ones, I was reminded of Frederick Jameson's revision of the term dialectical in the slogan that could be applied to Delmore's poetry and its particular tsuris. It's base and superstructural. Close in spirit to Erich Fromm, he tried to make the two levels of Marx and Freud, body and mind, cohere. It was a generative, poetic experiment. And now we'll go to Alan Wald.
Oh, thanks so much, David, and to Philip and the whole Red May crowd for inviting me to speak about what I think is a critical aspect of the poet Delmore Schwartz. And this is this intimate connection between Delmore's early Marxism and that of the legendary political journal Partisan Review, which, of course, David has accurately touched on. Now, you always need to start by emphasizing that the multiple and frequently scandalous personae of Delmore, who lived from 1913 to 1966, are notoriously difficult to untangle. Now, some of these public images we have of Delmore are drawn from some facts we know about his actual life, but many others come from the various fashionings of his posthumous biography. And all are full of a lot of ambiguities stemming from paradoxes, and some of these paradoxes may never be satisfactorily resolved. It almost seems to me as if there's a disconcerting non-center to Delmore's lives and achievements, or that some crucial aspect of the puzzle is missing, some crucial piece of the puzzle is missing. And for me, this opacity is encapsulated by a free verse lyric of the poet John Berryman and his portrayal of his deceased friend and mentor in his Dream Songs of 1969. There's just one passage where he refers to his dead poet friend as a, quote, cryptic man on a real but obscure mission. And it reads, "We never learnt why he came or what he wanted. His mission was obscure. His mission was real, but obscure." And otherwise, in many essays, reviews, memoirs, books, dissertations, Delmore emerges to us as an avant-garde modernist prodigy, as a pioneer of confessional poetry, as a lost soul, a restless wanderer, a poet maudit, a paranoid drunk, a mockingly self-analytical raconteur, a bullying psychopath, a martyred romantic idealist, and an icon of Jewish alienation, and in various combinations of these. I think the challenge in trying to see Delmore whole, is not only in deciding what aspects of these many Delmores, we should focus on. There's also a need to address what we don't talk about when we talk about Delmore. And this is primarily the deep-rooted commitment to dissident communist politics. This is communism here with a small c. And this was also the principal political framework that Delmore shared with the editors of the journal Partisan Review during their mutually formative decade of the 1930s. I'm going to abbreviate the magazine's name just to Partisan. It is that interface, which is at once elusive, but also candidly open, that I'm going to explore today. Now, from the what we might call the ecosystem of plausible political classifications, I'm selecting this term dissident communism, rather than the more customarily applied ones one uses for partisan. These are very often anti-communist with a capital C, or anti-communist with a lowercase c, anti-Stalinist, Marxist, Trotskyist, often preceded by a semi-Trotskyist. Now, perhaps I'm making only the least bad choice here, but I think that dissident communism is what can lead to a greater precision in tackling the two issues that are vital to my line of reasoning. First, the recognition of the nature of the political commitment that Delmore shared with Partisan, in which his liaison with Marxist theory is heterodox. And second, the investigation of selections of Delmore's writing for Partisan, in which the implicit presence of his leftism can be hard to discern. However, due to the time limitations, I can only make a brief reference to the writings, and they will be discussed more substantively in a longer version of this presentation that's going to be published in the Mad Hat Press collection of essays about Delmore that should come out next year. Now, it's not that these other political terms besides dissident communism are completely incorrect, but the problem is that the meaning of words can change over time. One could describe Delmore and Partisan as anti-Stalinist in 1937, which is at the founding of the new version of the journal Partisan Review, which had formerly been a communist John Reed Club publication. And you could use the same term again, anti-Stalinist, in 1946, when the editors signed on to that horrible reactionary editorial, The Liberal Fifth Column. But the politics would be qualitatively different across these 10 pivotal years and at odds with each other. And just to be clear, in the 1920s and 30s, that term anti-Stalinist was primarily employed by the far left and groups like Partisan or Delmore to critically differentiate themselves from the leading Stalin faction of Bolshevism. And they did that because, as, quote, anti-Stalinists, they still identified with the October 1917 insurrection, and frequently with Leninism. After all, if you're generally against all Bolshevism, you'd just say, well, I'm an anti-Bolshevik, and you would not set yourself apart from the particular faction led by Stalin. In contrast, after World War II, the term anti-Stalinist was weaponized by the US Cold War intellectual establishment. And this time, the term lost its original meaning and became a kind of battering ram for the, what we call the mother of all culture wars, the McCarthy era, Anti-Stalinism was now detached from the far left, and it became an umbrella term and was employed as a self-proclaimed credential by a wide range of political types who wanted to vilify people as un-American. So, saying you're anti-Stalinist rather than just saying, well, I'm an anti-communist, it has a kind of cachet of suggesting you're sophisticated and you have insider knowledge, in contrast to those Neanderthal type anti-communists like Joe McCarthy. So the issue here is not an exercise, in verbal quibbles. The absence of clarifying specifics enables some historians and memoirists to engage in evasive pirouettes to avoid very discomforting topics when it comes to Delmore. But I don't want to deny that Delmore's very turbulent life disturbs what you would like to treat as familiar and simple political definitions. His politics really don't come in some single translatable package, which means that the task of placing him turns out to be more like roughing out a location for his politics than, squeezing him into a definite category. But problematically, in all the scholarly books that discuss the politics of partisan, there is not much more than some passing references to Delmore and to his writings. And in the writings about Delmore, there's not much that details his political affinity with partisan. And above all, I don't see anything in any scholarship that would correspond to Saul Bellow's memorable depiction of Delmore as the young Humboldt von Fleischer in his acclaimed novel, Humboldt's Gift. Here's his inscription. Then, quote, then and there I realized that if I didn't read Trotsky at once, I wouldn't be worth conversing with. Humboldt talked to me about Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, the Smolny Institute, the Shatsky engineers, the Moscow trials, Sidney Hook's From Hegel to Marx, Lenin's The State and Revolution. In fact, he compared himself to Lenin. That's the political mentality of the partisan circle at that time. They were Leninists. And in that sense, the Delmore that most people write about and hear about has truly become a kind of lost partisan. And I hope that finding him can help recover his political identity. So that actually shouldn't be so hard to do, because there are a lot of documents proving that Delmore was very intimately associated with the entire political trajectory of the post-1937 partisan. For example, Delmore taught with the key partisan editors at the spring 1939 Marxist school that was sponsored by a Trotskyist group, the Socialist Workers' Party. Delmore then joined all the partisan editors in fall 1939, supporting the political statements of the League for Cultural Freedom and Socialism, as David mentioned, with an organization of revolutionary intellectuals on an international scale, largely inspired by Trotskyism. He was then part of a group of three who determined partisan review policy after 1943, and he was even identified by the founding editor, William Phillips, as the journal's single most representative figure and expressive of its ethos. This is from Phillips's autobiography. Quote, if any writer could be singled out as the most extreme representative of the new intellectual grouping, it would be Delmore Schwartz, who embodied most of the strains that came together in a period. Moreover, the precision of the politics of partisan and the editors at that time should be no secret for anybody who just checks the record. None of it adds up to some kind of vague radical socialism that we could just dismiss as secondary, a mere pose. You don't have to take it too seriously. Any initial editorials and letters that clarify partisans' views after 37, there's always this emphatic specificity about several matters. First, Partisan was adamant in that inaugurating editorial that it was, quote, revolutionary in tendency, and that, quote, Partisan Review is aware of its responsibility to the revolutionary movement in general, unquote. In their second editorial, they explain, quote, our program is the program of Marxism, which in general terms means being for the overthrow of capitalist society, for a workers' government, for an international socialism. And then there's the private correspondence with exiled Bolshevik Leon Trotsky, where they explain, quote, all of us are committed to a Leninist program of action. So what particularly rankled the partisan editors back then was when the adjective revolutionary was omitted from descriptions of the new publication, especially by opponents. They considered any deletion of that term to be a strategy to smear its far left politics as, reformist, something less. For example, in October 1938, they wrote a letter of protest to the New Republic about the way that literary critic Malcolm Cowley, who was generally then regarded as pro-communist, a damn good critic, the way he selectively quoted their founding editorial to imply that the journal was claiming to be apolitical. Quote, one sentence that Cowley did not quote was, any magazine that aspires to place in the vanguard of literature today will be revolutionary in tendency. That is clear enough, surely. So for them to be classified within a framework of revolutionary and not simply radical anti-capitalist, that was a point of honor. Now, what does it mean then that practically all of our best scholars describe Delmore himself as, quote, not a Marxist, and even, in the words of the authoritative biographer James Atlas, as, quote, always apolitical? How could an apolitical individual and non-Marxist possibly have such a close relation with such an exceedingly political and unambiguously pro-revolutionary Marxist-Leninist venture? So my hope is by insistently positing the tradition of dissident communism as a kind of framework for both Delmore and partisan, we'll be able to see more clearly who these writers and editors actually were in their own time and how they should be read in ours. Now, of course, all right, this concept of dissident communism, that may be a bit hard to grasp in Trump's America of 2025. And the reason is due to a sea change in mid-20th century political history. In the post-World War II era, communism capital or communism C, lower c, came to be an almost automatically conflated with the hegemonic Soviet brand. And this was generally tagged as a foreign movement more loyal to the Soviet Union than the US. But earlier, when Delmore and partisan molded their outlook in the 30s, multiplicities of pariah versions of communism were energetically on the scene. The political landscape, and especially in urban centers, included vital pockets of anarcho-communists, council communists, Bukharinists, Trotskyists, and numerous permutations that were Leninist and non-Leninist. And they were certainly not creatures of foreign governments, most of which wanted to exterminate them. Examples of these heretics are not difficult to locate if you're familiar with the legacy of the far left. One finds dissident communists among the one-time Bukharin followers. Theologian Will Herbergs are very famous. The civil rights activist Pauli Murray, the historian Bertram D. Wolfe. There were famous council communists, Paul Maddock, Fairfield Porter, who was an artist, Karl Korsch. There were maverick Trotskyists, some of whom are still popular today, C.L.R. James, Raya Dunyaskaya, Hal Draper, very important. And there were lots of unclassifiable communists. Edmund Wilson, who wanted to take communism away from the communists. Lewis Mumford was a communist. Melvin D. Tolson, the African-American modernist poet. These writers and thinkers comprise a smaller, but for some reasons more recuperable Marxist legacy than the official communism, Stalinism. And Delmore and partisan fit roughly into this dissident communist tradition because the journal often published the preeminent dissident communist thinkers. They published Karl Korsch, they published Paul Maddock, and they published lots of Victor Serge, who was always translated by Delmore's first wife, Gertrude Buckman. Even if, this match is a bit fuzzy around the edges, it coordinates far better with this rubric, partisan and dissident communism, than with the politics of social democracy or New Deal or other varieties of radicalism. So, like many others, Delmore and partisan, they were most sure of their Marxism during the Great Depression. But even then, their existence was an outsider one. Remember that the Popular Front reigned, so they were in a kind of political demimonde in those years. Then during World War II, they found that their trajectory was increasingly troubled by a lot of unexpected events of the war, unpredicted. And the result of that was that only some stayed the course, others began to de-radicalize, move to the right. And finally, in the post-war era, practically all the partisan editors and people around them became politically mainstream through assimilation into Cold War anti-communism. But how we begin this story really matters. By 1937, Delmore and Partisan had already been committed to Marxism for some years. But what in 1937 made them into dissident communists was not only due to their communist opposition to the Stalin leadership of the Soviet Union, it was because even as they retained their revolutionary Marxist framework, in several secondary respects, they inclined toward what the orthodox-minded would see as heretical ideas and behavior. What I mean is that Delmore and Partisan mostly stood aloof from more than brief party membership. Some of them had been party members, Rov, Phillips, FWDP, and so on, but they didn't stay. And they functioned more as men of letters and academics. They mixed Freud and other theoretical work with historical materialism. They eschewed those aspects of Marxist philosophy that they thought were positivistic or required belief in dialectical laws of nature. And they mostly limited their activism to their critical and creative work. So as intellectuals who were less involved in economics and much more focused on cultural work, they do comprise a US counterpart of what New Left Review editor Perry Anderson dubbed Western Marxism. However, along with the far more plentiful pro-Soviet communists, there was this idea of political commitment as a kind of obsession with them, even though, like a lot of Marxists today, they were not professional full-time cadres or union leaders and so on. They did believe that you had to choose sides between classes and participate in history through principled politics. And one example of this principled stance was dramatized 1939, when Delmore and every single member of the partisan editorial board absolutely refused to sign the May 1939 Declaration of the Committee for Cultural Freedom. This is the precursor to the notorious CIA-funded American Committee for Cultural Freedom of 1951, which, of course, most of the editors would join 12 years later. The 1939 document simplistically amalgamates fascism and the Soviet Union, leaves aside Western imperialism, it's not a problem, as comprising a, quote, tide of totalitarianism washing away cultural and creative freedom. To refuse to join in 1939 meant that they had to break sharply with a number of their mentors, and especially Sidney Hook, who had been the teacher of Delmore and was a big figure in the early partisan review. So that's why it's not enough to simply extract some general idea of, Delmore and partisan politics, and then just move on to other literary matters, because these details can matter. For example, it's not sufficient to reiterate that from 1937, Partisan always opposed the Communist Party, the CPUSA. This was always for different reasons before and after World War II. If you study their editorials, you can clearly see three stages of public critique of the CPUSA, and Delmore might have even articulated all of these. First, in 1937, the opposition was stated because the CPUSA supposedly attempted to control literary policy among its members and supporters. In 1938, the partisan review editors then condemned the CPUSA for being reformist and compared it to social democracy. And then in 1939, the central issue for Partisan became the belief that the CP was promoting international war through the Popular Front, a war that would be led by capitalist imperialist nations and Stalinism to expand imperialist holdings. They did not use the term anti-communist in this period, and it was only by increments that they began to interpolate the term Stalinism into their pages. However, if you look at the private correspondence and other sources, you can see that the underlying vision of the political future was pretty much parallel to that of the Trotskyists. They didn't want their magazine to be identified with, any particular specific organization, but they favored the idea of building a new communist party for the United States and worldwide a new communist international to coordinate world socialist revolution. They wrote a group letter to Leon Trotsky at that time, which stated, quote, "We believe in the need for a new party to take the place of the corrupted Comintern." Now, one problem is that Delmore and Partisan, like other dissident communists, and especially the Trotskyists, they had an unrealistic prediction for an on-the-horizon social revolution. The idea was that the world events would sort of repeat World War I and produce a working class uprising. This time would be against fascism, against capitalism. It would overthrow the leadership of the Stalinist state and so on. And this was critical to the alternative political perspective they had during the war. So when this socialist strategy built on a very different future from what world political events were preparing, they pretty soon ended up inhabiting a very small political space that never grabbed much traction. Still, it's a space that's not understood because they were anti-fascist. They did believe in an armed struggle against fascism, but they didn't believe in following the capitalist powers and what they were doing. Now, as a result of all this, and especially the later turn to the right, the reputation of Partisan really suffered terribly and probably justifiably, moving to the right so much in the Cold War. But there's still parts of this earlier tradition that I think retain a moral authority, things that Delmore believed in. And it's not just because they were critical from the left of the Communist Party. In particular, they were more left and more right and on the questions of racism and the violence of the imperialist system during the Second World War, much more than this alliance of liberals and communists in the Popular Front. The Popular Front alliance believed in anything that would support the U.S. military war effort, no matter what it did to human beings. And Delmore and the heretics of the Wing Around Partisan Review, and especially those who separated into Politics magazine, 1944, which was led by one of the partisan editors, Dwight MacDonald, they recognized and they denounced the barbarism perpetrated by the fire bombings of Japan and Dresden and the atomic bomb used by U.S. after the war, which the communists and liberals celebrated as a great advance for humanity. They opposed the deepening racism during the war. They opposed the internment of Japanese Americans, which the communists and the liberals supported. They opposed the perpetuation of a segregated military. And they recognized that the racial uprisings in Harlem, Detroit, and Los Angeles during the war were legitimate uprisings, whereas the communists and liberals said that, oh, they were inspired by objectively aligned with the fascists and stuff like that. They also saw the long-term imperialist aims that were underlying U.S. foreign policy, that after the war, the United States would attempt to replace the French colonialism and British colonialism and so on. So, nevertheless, there was a failure of the revolutionary predictions about social change. So apostasy set in, which so often does. And also you would see now this self-motivated revision of the record of Partisan perpetuated by the partisan editors themselves. And this is clearest in 1946. They put out a book called The Partisan Reader, which was edited by William Phillips and Philip Roth, the chief editors. The introduction was edited by one of the regular partisan contributors, Lionel Trilling, and he says that the origin of Partisan was in its refusal to accept the Communist Party's, quote, divorce between politics and the imagination. And then he goes on without one single reference to revolution, Marx, Lenin, the overthrow of capitalism, international socialism. And then there's an afterword to the book called In Retrospect, written by Phillips and Roth. And here they substitute a group of slippery, ill-defined euphemisms for partisans' politics. They talk about it being radical and independent. Then in 1953, they put out a second volume called The New Partisan Reader. And in the foreword to that book, there aren't even references to being radical or independent. The distinguishing feature of Partisan Review is, quote, it approached literature as a part of the total culture. That's what it boils down to then. Okay, so what about the part played by the Marxist presence in Delmore's critical imaginative writing. And I'll be briefer on this. Clearly, Marxism should be seen as a substantial element, and it must be acknowledged, but you can't overstate its centrality. Where I think a consensus exists would be that Marxism played a role, along with Freudianism and other influences, in Delmore's contextualization of his experiences in his writing, as David has suggested. But it would be a distortion to reduce any of his writings just to Marxism. And I think we could best describe Delmore as a writer who was a Marxist, but not simply a Marxist writer. And by and large, he did adhere to Marxist politics. And I think this is, even after he adapted to the Cold War, he would say things that sounded pretty revolutionary and Marxist, as in that critique of Sidney Hook and so on. Which is also, by the way, the case with Philip Roth. He just kept his Leninism, under wraps until the 1960s, and then he startled all of us by reemerging again. Now, at first glance, this idea that Delmore was not a Marxist, that seems kind of preposterous, because there are many accounts of Delmore as a Marxist from the early 30s into the 40s that comport with one another. And I can only find one or two statements that might suggest the opposite. For example, Maurice Zalatalo, who became a very famous show business writer, he wrote a satirical novel about Delmore, but elsewhere he recorded how, as a, quote, devout member of the Young Communist League at University of Wisconsin, he, quote, gave Delmore Marxism. And Delmore listened eagerly to talk of the new Soviet man, although he did sneer at the literary criticism from the Moscow publication International Literature. Then there's William Barrett, the existentialist philosopher. We all read The Irrational Man back in the 60s. He was a partisan editor. He confirms that Delmore and he were Marxists by 1934. And the journal that Delmore co-edited that year, called Mosaic, which I think was an NYU publication, identified itself as a Marxist aesthetic publication. And of course, Delmore's two major professors and his sponsors at the time were Sidney Hook and James Burnham, who were Marxists. And for that same period, there's a fellow student of Delmore's named Ruth Ageloff, later Trotsky's secretary. She claimed that Delmore was part of a group of members and supporters of a Trotskyist group that would meet regularly at James Burnham's apartment. Then, as was mentioned, in 1936, he publishes in the Social Poets number of poetry, which was almost entirely Communist Party poets, edited by Horace Gregory. When he goes to Harvard, again, he associates with Marxists. The poet John Wheelwright, a Trotskyist poet who was hanging around Harvard at that time, wrote a letter to the Theoretical Journal of the Trotskyists, saying that Delmore was a sympathizer of Trotskyism. And of course, Delmore famously participated in the Marxist Quarterly, a very clearly dissident communist journal that several Leninist parties published. And so, I think the problem is that for the most part, Delmore doesn't seem to resemble, your popular notion of what a Marxist should look like or act like. He never proselytizes on behalf of a political line. He clearly doesn't produce socialist, realist, or agitational poetry or fiction. But the only two references I can find where he says he's not a Marxist are in private correspondence. And it seems to me in context, he's saying he's not an orthodox Marxist, which would, again, it fits clearly with the dissident communist tradition. That being an orthodox Marxist was not a requirement for the dissident communist tradition or Western Marxism. And the people that he identified with in these circles, Meyer Shapiro, the art historian, Sidney Hook, James Burnham, Felix Morrow, Jean van Huysenoy, these were not orthodox Marxists either. So that's a fairly normal characteristic. But I have to say at the same time, Delmore didn't want to be labeled as anything but a poet. That was his self-image. So he would evade being just sort of stereotyped as a Leninist or something like that. Now, in the end, let me just say that all of these writers and poets, or many poets in the 30s who consider themselves revolutionaries and Marxists and communists, they all forged this distinct path to Marxism. There's a kind of common trajectory, but there's a lot of unique material in Delmore, and I think we can trace these back now with the help of the this Ben Mazur collection here, which is quite extraordinary because he has material that was never published before or wasn't in his books. And you can see that by the earliest 30s, Delmore is going with a synthesis of modernism and communism years before he hooked up the partisan. Let me just point to the poem in here called Poem for Jacques Maritain and Leon Trotsky. I think this is 1931. This is significant for dramatizing all of the fireworks that are going to appear in Delmore's work between a kind of neo-Thomist aesthetic sensibility. Maritain was a big promoter of Thomas Aquinas, and Bolshevik politics. These literary pyrotechnics would agitate much of his creative work throughout the rest of his life and cause a lot of paradoxical perceptions. Let me just read part of this poem. Let me read the poem. It's very short because it forecasts so much of what will happen in Delmore. It reads, "The Gentile night and the white stars in Congress still the traffic's racked energy, and the hurdy-gurdy newsreel of memory flashes the past in its stilted sadness. Standing on what brink then? By my room's window, thinking of the sources of situation, of the people's confrontation when they see themselves dirty in another's shadow. O Marxist, drunk at the teats of Tiresias, is night still close to morning? Will the morning once more from ruinous darkness release us? Tonight is more than night and more than meaning. Stars are the buds of morning, do you know? Look in the west at the white moon dreaming of snow." Now, obviously, this insomniac narrator we see often in Delmore of the poem, he's staring out the window at night at the traffic. It clearly anticipates the poem that David talked about in the naked bed in Plato's cave. Then we have, quote, the hurdy-gurdy newsreel memory, which looks forward to Delmore's surrealist masterwork in Dreams, Responsibilities. Then the narrator is thinking on the sources of a situation that draws us to Maritain's first principles. And then he moves to this question of the role and limits of causality, especially that line, when they see themselves dirty in another's shadow, showing the importance of the impact of your ancestors' behavior on your own. And then we have other lines and so on that I think reach forward to the future. Let me just mention finally that the image of snow he ends on, that's all throughout Delmore's work. The snow is big. But that goes back to his reading of Trotsky's Literature and Revolution. If you read Trotsky's Literature and Revolution, that's the main metaphor Trotsky uses for a social whirlwind of revolution in which individuals become the flakes. So none of what I said is to suggest that this framework of dissident communism is a magic key, to his writing. It's a kind of a framework that I think will help us discover who the lost partisan really was and restore him to the way he should be seen. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alan. I think it's my turn now. Okay, I'll try to hurry through this since basically I think David and Alan have said most of what I would want to say. I looked at my bookshelf this morning, and on one shelf I found the following books: Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1864-65, In Marx's Laboratory, Marxist Monetary Theory, Marx's Capital, Hegel's Logic, Marx and the Common, Marxist Theory of the Genesis of Money, Marxist Temporalities, the Marxist Conception of the State, Responses to Marx, Translating Marx. Delmore Schwartz would have had access to none of those books or to that scholarship. Those are all part of a series published by Historical Materialism, which has published over the last 12 years, 14 books, not all of them about Marx, but I picked the ones that were about Marx. There are historical studies of the Hispanic Civil War, Spanish Civil War. You will have things on Austro-Marxism and so forth, and many things. And I wanted to sort of read that out because I want to make a distinction between what we think Marxism is now and what it might have been in the 30s to the people at Partisan and so forth. I mean, I think Alan said it well. I can't remember how he phrased it, but it said it, you know, everybody has sort of vague conceptions of what being a Marxist or Marxism is. So what I want to suggest is in the 30s, let's say up to about 37, we had a continuous revolution from 1917. It was simply, there were lulls, there were long lulls, there were, you know, it differed from country to country in Europe and so forth, but everybody was conscious of being everybody who was on the left was conscious of being part of this ongoing development world movement. And so what I want to say is that I think Saul Bellow's description of what people were reading and thinking about was exactly on point as to what Delmore might do. It was Soviet-centric in the sense that Soviets were the leading edge of the revolution at that time. What happened in the Soviet Union would affect whatever happened elsewhere in the world and so forth. But nobody was talking about value form theory. I mean, people were studying it in obscure places, but the scholarship wasn't available to people in America, even to people like Sidney Hook, or the people who were most theoretically guarded. So why do I make this point? What I'm thinking is that the key elements of Marxism that are in the background of the PR view is the class struggle. And Marxism is a theory of history, which is directionally pointed at the arrival of communism and also things like alienation, but other things that are a part of our notion of Marxism now and thinking of it. Essentially, how capitalism functioned in a nuts and bolts fashion, how it managed to extend itself, was not as much, was not the sort of thing that Delmore would have known or would have even been interested in. So a friend of mine used to say to me that make the argument that New York was culturally Jewish, that everybody living in New York, essentially their sense of humor was Jewish. They just picked it up and so forth. And I would say that, you know, that Delmore was culturally Marxist because that's what the environment in Partisan Review was, around Partisan Review, particularly in those early years. He would sign letters occasionally for one thing or another, but the notion of getting involved in the kind of debates in cubicle 1 or 2 in City College, people who grown up, Delmore was much more focused on debating poetry and on debating, you know. So that's one thing. It's not saying that he's not a Marxist. He uses the word capitalism at a time when always uses that word, when a time when the people who are defenders of the system would talk about the free enterprise system. They only started using capitalism in the last 10 or 12 years because they're now championing it and defending it. So I think in a certain way, I'm going around in a kind of incoherent way saying essentially you have to rough out Delmore's position, as Alan said, to kind of find out. So I'm going to use a kind of cultural yardstick here to deal with Delmore, which is the kind of a conflict with Lionel Trilling and the question of whether Lionel Trilling should be writing as much for Partisan Review in 37 or so forth. He had written a lot. I don't know, people may not know who Lionel Trilling is at the time. Let's say in the 50s was the height of his fame. He was the first Jewish professor hired at Columbia. It was an English department. He wrote a book called A Liberal Imagination, and he was essentially all his life, he was essentially a liberal with a kind of period where in the 30s he was active in the defense of political prisoners. I forget what the name of that, but they all were, Dupee and other professors who later ended up at Columbia. And Harold Rosenberg, the great art critic, who was a Marxist, would stopped in a partisan review and said to Rav one day, "Why do you keep publishing someone like Trilling, who's simply making a case for bourgeois values?" Now that particularly stung with Philip Rav, because even though Partisan was shifting, he maintained this notion that Partisan was a magazine that combined radical theory with the support of the avant-garde in art. So the notion that someone was importing bourgeois values in was something, anyway, that he didn't like to recognize, and it gave him kind of worried nights and so forth. At which point Delmore, who had heard about this, jumped in and said, "I want to write something about Trilling." So he wrote an essay on one of Trilling's later anthologized pieces included in the liberal imagination, called Manners, Morals, and the Novel. And by the way, the argument against Trilling at the time, the literary argument, was he was writing essays championing Jane Austen and E.M. Forster. And Partisan liked to think of itself as a Kafka-Joyce modernist publication. So the notion of smuggling all this Victorian stuff or early in or Edwardian, well, whatever one would call Forster anyway, was kind of worrying to Rav. So Trilling's argument was something like this in the essay. I'm going to reduce it to very simple. There's a famous argument by Henry James in an article about Hawthorne, where he says why you can't write novels in America. Why there's no church, there's no aristocracy, there are no country gentlemen, there are no manners, no sporting class, no parsonages, no palaces, and so forth. America sort of lacked this social texture, which was necessary for novels. Now, Trilling, of course, thought of the novel as what is really a subcategory of the novel of manners, that was exclusive for Trilling what the novel was about, because in Victorian times, in the 19th century, one could argue that that was basically, certainly in England, what it was about. And what Delmore said was that Trilling confuses the notion of manners and mores, the larger cultural sense, what Trilling calls the hum and buzz of implication of all the social institutions around, with good manners and the propriety and bourgeois proprieties. And in the essay, he kind of keeps shuttling back and forth without acknowledging it between one thing and another. And that to me meshes very well with my own experience of Trilling as a student and sort of what I know and the stories I heard at Columbia when I was there in the 60s. There's the famous story of Trilling talking with Ginsberg, who was a student of his, about Kerouac's novel, which was about to come out. And Trilling said, that whether it was going to be a good novel, Trilling said, how can it be a good novel when Kerouac was an accessory to a murder? And he's referring to a famous incident where a friend of Ginsberg and Kerouac's named Lucien Carr was stalked by a teacher named Kammerer, who had come all the way from the Midwest to follow him, and Lucien stabbed him, and then called Kerouac and Ginsberg. He was desperate, and Kerouac and Ginsberg, I forget whether they hid the body and took him away or whatever, but they were just sort of helping out a friend. But the notion that that makes it impossible to write a good novel is sort of saying, all right, forget it, Celine, you know, you can't write anything good. I wouldn't even pick up a pen, you know. And this notion that of Trilling called moral realism, which is just something he advocates in that essay, you know, that it's all about these kind of how people make choices in social institutions, is inadequate in terms of dealing with the kind of literature that was being produced in the world at the time, the modernist literature. So I won't go any more on this. I have much more to say, but I want to give Michael a chance to talk. But what I would say is this at the end, that two things to remember when we talk about modern literature at the time is one, that we don't want to get modernism and the avant-garde mixed up as if they were the same thing. Surrealism being an avant-garde, experimental modernism being something else. Gertrude Stein was interested in writing as an experimental modernist, finding the equivalent of what would Cubist writing be, you know? Whereas with the avant-garde, starting from Dada and Surrealism, they were basically trying to end art and find ways out of it into something else as a reaction to the shock of World War I and so forth. It was an anti-art movement. And even though Surrealism ended up basically as a school of painting, what they started off doing was putting people on trial, leading excursions around Paris to discover the marvelous, opening a bureau of surrealist research in a store and asking people to come in and astonish them. You know, their successors are the situationists, who one could argue were the real surrealists who continued along that line. So it's important to keep that as a distinction, which was something that, for example, was unknown to Trilling, but someone like John Ashbery would know. The second distinction that's important is to distinguish what I call the modern from modernism. Everybody tells the story of Edgar Allan Poe, Baudelaire, the symbolists, Eliot, and that being the line that leads to modernism, and what Delmore has put in that line. But the other thing about modernism in much of the world, or the modern, is there's a line that goes through Guillaume Apollinaire and Sandra, Blaise Sandra, and Larbeau, that goes to Mayakovsky, that goes to Pessoa, writing as, I think it's Alvaro de Campos, his Whitman-esque. And that line comes from Walt Whitman, not from symbolism. And that's a totally different approach to the modern. There's no sort of need to decipher it. A Marinetti would be at that before he became a futurist. It's a celebration of cities, trains, airplanes, speed. There are no Mallarmé syntactical difficulties. There's no need to decipher what's being written. Everything is there on the surface. They're not using indirection and all those objective correlatives and things that are supposed to be, you know, that become part of the confessional poetry in America. And the reason I say this is a line that led, you know, to Neruda and to Dario in his last phase. And it's one that, again, Delmore, one could sense a certain affinity that Delmore would have had with this if it was better known in America. But because I think some of the stuff that he writes, you know, moves in this mode naturally anyway. So that's all I have to say. Definitely I guess I totally agree with what everybody's said before with Alan, even though I've maybe refined the Marxist. Delmore was a person who would think of capitalism as the background to what he was living, but was not a person who would be a Marxologist, because a lot of the material wasn't available then for people to look at. But he He was not a joiner basically in anything, but capitalism shows up in his poems and as the background, and we have to see that as a social texture, which he sees. So I'll move on to Michael now.
Oh, well, that's so great because like in Genesis, sort of his central text, or should be thought of that way, capitalism appears as capitalismus and is referred to over and over again as sort of like character or part of the American scene, a shaping influence. And that's really sort of ignored in a way. So that's why what everybody has already said is so important and so wonderful, because it's an area that hasn't really been explored or touched on at all. I mean, when I think of Delmore and sort of like politics or radical politics or leftist politics, I think of Rimbaud, because Delmore translated A Season in Hell. And it was the first time in English that the entire book had been translated and appeared in English. And it was and Delmore was directly responsible for that. He lobbied for it from James Laughlin that he would publish it as part of the New Directions series. And so, and when he talked about that translation and how he went about it, he said in the letters, he mentions that how important Marx is to understanding Rimbaud and his version of Rimbaud, and Rimbaud really, I mean, to me, Delmore, people mention the Eliot influence, but for me, Rimbaud is like even more of a greater influence because it's sort of an unconscious influence, and it sort of runs through his work from beginning to end, especially with Summer Knowledge, the last poems. They feel very Rimbaud-like to me, full of Rimbauden energies and sort of like unleashing new ideas and a new interpretation of reality and life. And that sort of like ties into the idea of a revolution, the revolution in society and government and society and the way we interact with each other and how we imagine poetry. I mean, what's funny is there's this idea of literary modernism, sort of like questioning democracy and being fascist. And that aspect of literary modernism with Pound and Eliot and so on, this was something that, I mean, Delmore explicitly sort of cut off ties with Pound. He wrote a famous letter in which he denounces Pound's anti-Semitism and how he's no longer going to be a faithful reader of his work. And he doesn't really cut ties with Eliot so much, but there is an interesting moment in the journals in the late 40s where he says, where he sort of despairs about the influence of Joyce versus Eliot, that if he had been more, if instead of Eliot, he had taken Joyce as his model early on, how different things would have been. And you can really see there how Joyce, especially with Finnegan's Wake, reinventing not just English, but every world language. And the idea of, to mention Coriolanus, the figure of the Shakespearean figure of Coriolanus, it was something that Delmore identified with, and which is why he wrote that verse play about him. But like, to me, Coriolanus is sort of like a modernist poet. He's sort of against the people, like the society that wants to sort of like tell you what to do and how to react, and how you're supposed to get in line, and that ties in with the Rimbaud idea of like resisting everything, the powers that be, the establishment, and to really chart your own course. And to me, that really shows up in the late poems, because they've been so derided and they've been misunderstood and they've been mischaracterized. And really, in a sense, I mean, one critic was trying to put Delmore down and said that these Summer Knowledge poems are like flower power, psychedelia, like Grateful Dead lyrics or something. And to me, that's exactly it. He's a precursor. What he's tapping into is this sort of an era to come that he's too early for it, but he's sort of a harbinger of it by with this sort of like belief in, and which is why I guess Rimbaud is so important to like Jim Morrison and Patti Smith. It's natural, that affinity, because for Delmore that was there from the beginning, and the idea of poetry as resistance, as sort of like going against the grain and articulating something that might, which is probably why like he has taken so much flack over the years, because it's hard to pigeonhole what he's doing, or it's hard to classify it, or it's difficult to analyze it, because there's so many influences. Obviously, as a famous insomniac, he read everybody. So in a sense, in a way, if you love Delmore's work, you kind of have to become like Delmore. You have to read everybody. You have to read everything, all history. You have to read every writer. You have to read, and to me, when I look at Summer Knowledge, for example, to me, well, I'll put it this way. Delmore always said his two greatest influences were Shakespeare and the Great Depression. So the Shakespeare part, he always fashioned himself or idealized himself as a Shakespearean fool, as somebody, as the sort of the contra to what was happening around him. And for me, sort of like it immediately came to mind when I started thinking about it, that Will Summer, who is the jester for King Henry VIII, it's an automatic connection that Summer Knowledge is Summer Knowledge, Somer, for Will Summer. And over and again in his poetry, in his letters, he always said, he at one point in Summer Knowledge, he talks about I am the fool, and he capitalizes the letter fool, as an identity, as something, as not just as something larger, as a way to, as a kind of a philosophical approach to life, and coming of age as he did during the 30s, leftist or communist or Marxist communist politics, that was like mainstream then. So it's so natural that he would gravitate toward it. And he was a big reader of Marx. Marx was a character that he used in his work, Marx and Freud. And Freud, another figure, derided and criticized, and Delmore being criticized for his affinity for Freud. So, and what's also interesting is like he was, throughout his career, even though he had that great success early on with In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, he was always somebody who was on the margins, even though he was famous and he had the famous friends, the intelligentsia of the time, he knew them, he wrote to them. It does seem that he was the Shakespearean fool. He was never really part of the court of that inner circle. He was always on the margins. And what's interesting is that he was a big supporter of Adlai Stevenson, and he was very anti Eisenhower. And it's hard to imagine that, because Eisenhower was the guy who defeated Hitler, and the great sort of like America of the 50s, financially successful, world dominating, America, this great American, the American dream, the vision of America as a world superpower, the number one place to be, America is number one. And Delmore is proud of the fact that he votes for Adlai Stevenson, and he's in despair when Stevenson doesn't win. So, that's why everything that's been said today is so important, because it's you need to plug that in when you look at Delmore.
That's great. I mean, so I guess the Stevenson stuff and Humboldt's gift is in fact fairly accurate what happened. I mean, I remember Actually, my first political memory is All the Way with Adlai, which my parents had up in the house. But
I mean, what's funny, yeah, what's funny about Humboldt's Gift is that it kind of distorts Delmore in a way. I mean, sometimes it's quoted as if it were a memoir or or a biography of some kind, but it's fiction. It's made up, and there are a lot of things in there that don't really jibe with the Delmore you find in the letters or even in the Atlas biography. But I mean, this idea, you know, he was a mentor to Saul Bellow. Like he was one of the first people to write a review of Augie March, and he took him under his wing. And so when Delmore was given a position, a temporary, you know, for a year at Princeton, he took Bellow along with him as his assistant, and he went out of his way to do that, and he groomed him and cultivated him. And when Augie March came along, he was the biggest supporter of it. So this idea of the Bellovian character, I mean, in all of his novels, critics like to say, well, this character, Henderson, is based on this guy, or, you know, to go down the line, you know, Herzog is, you know, but to me, when you look at the Bellovian cast, in a lot of ways, it's just different forms of Delmore, because the expansive sort of like motor mouth omnivore that you get in Bellow, that is sort of his, like, and it is sometimes taken for Bellow himself, to me is totally Delmore. I mean, the idea of being in an automat, you know, drinking 500 cups of coffee and debating the Russian Revolution, and there's actually a great line that I'm remembering from Seize the Day, and there's a scene or Bellow says something like, in order to have a conversation, you had to know everything from the very beginning. You had to, it's not just to go back to 1800. You almost had to go back to, you know, like the Garden of Eden, and know everything that happened from then until now as a reference for it to enter this discussion. And so that is totally Delmore. I mean, he read everything, he knew everything, and he had the whole world inside of him, which is why his work is so diverse. I mean, you can name, I mean, it's very, I mean, I don't know if you could name another writer who influenced fiction and poetry. I mean, In Dreams Begin Responsibilities is like a defining work of 20th century fiction. And it's hard to imagine what comes after without having that come first, as well as in poetry. And I mean, as it was mentioned before, the idea of the confessional poets, but also, you know, Genesis, you know, it reads like a novel in a way, and sort of like those great big American novels that Bellow would write seem to come out of Genesis. Like Delmore is the example that like Berryman takes for when he does the dream songs. I mean, this idea of a great big work that includes everything, you know, when Berryman first encounters or is given Genesis, it's like he's described, it's like his mind has been blown open. Like he can't believe it. It's like you have to metabolize that. What's possible now because of that book, and so in order to grasp his influence or what he's trying to do, you really have to recognize just how deep his roots were in terms of being a mentor. I mean, he was one of the first people to publish Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery in the Partisan Review. I mean, you could go down the line of all of the sort of great writers. Lowell, when he does life studies, you know, he said, well, I started writing the book because of Howell. But really, to me, Howell became a sensation and like electrified America. And so Lowell is who, to me, kind of always had a sense of his audience and what his audience wanted from him in a way. He goes in the confessional direction with life studies as a way to sort of like jump on that train in a way. But for me, he gets that inspiration initially from Genesis, because Lowell is really like this guy born of the new critics, sort of don't personalize, leave yourself out of it. And you look at his early work, and it's very much that. It's sedate, it's strong, but it's not personal. But here comes Delmore, sort of like being the anti-Eliot, anti-new critic, even though he was great friends with the new critics, going his own way. And that idea of sort of like doing your own thing, no matter the cost, because everybody piled on him and he went his own way anyway, doesn't become vogue for another, 20 years or so.
We don't want to make him sound like Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. What we haven't talked about is his wonderful conversationalism. Everybody says he was a fabulous conversationalist, and they said he's not a monologuist, but he'll start a conversation, he'll ask people questions, and it'll go on for 10 hours and be fascinating.
Right. I mean, Bellow called him the Mozart of conversation. So, I mean, it's hard to beat that. I mean, and also Jean Stafford, the first wife of Robert Lowell, wrote a story called where Delmore is a character, and you get exactly that, what you're talking about, that sort of, that he was so warm, and he was curious about you, and he wanted to know what you were thinking, because maybe he wanted to challenge you about what you were thinking, which is kind of ties into that 30s Marxist idea of debate. And like everybody gets together in a big room and we start debating the ideas. And that's what it's all about. And so he really takes that forward.
Anybody have a favorite Schwartz bon mot? He was also,
he called Philip Robb.
Philip Robb never lets the scruples get in his way.
He called him a manic impressive.
A manic impressive, yeah.
I just wanted to intervene a little bit and say, in reviewing the collected poems and spending so much time with his work in the last year and a half, I started to think about what his meaning is for the present. And I was kind of talking about this before we came online. Today we have in American poetry almost the ubiquitous project book. And we have audiences for poetry that are kind of trained on memoirs or, internet kind of forms of writing. And everything has to be appropriately kind of marketed. And they're thinking about, MFA programs and how they can maybe present their work to students. And so when you think back to some of these very arresting works like Genesis or In Dreams, these early and kind of middle works, they really do seem also now to be forerunners of this kind of project book. And Michael, you were bringing up Genesis as an example of a novel. I mean, what is more in vogue today than these kind of auto-fictional novels where people kind of very loosely, vary the name of their, I'm thinking of Ben Lerner, for example. They kind of slightly altered the name, and but they put more or less the character right in their shoes in Spain or whatever, in New York. And so there's a way in which I think that his work, seen in this light, could take on some new relevance. There's also the story, as you were bringing up, Michael, the character in Genesis practically of capitalism itself, and of, as I was trying to bring out in my review, he had a Trotskyist kind of sense of the combined and uneven historical development of the economic system. And so he's often referring back to Russia and to the warfare of the 19th century and to the emergence of this kind of society out of a background of peasant serfdom. And, and there is today, I think, just thinking about his legacy for the present, there is, since the 2008 crisis, a renewed interest in Marxism among a younger generation. its explanatory power with respect to the capitalist crisis of 2008. And there could be a way in which we could start to see renewal and interest in some of his work from that vantage point too. So I think, Alan does an amazing job of bringing out these dissident communist traditions that inform his reconstruction of Delmore's life. And in a way, that's a lot of what constitutes the far left in the United States today, is a kind of mode of dissident communism. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of these strains of anarchism, anarcho-communism, council communism, kind of got a moment in the sun, and that moment has just continued since that time. So it's very interesting to think about, some of the things Alan's putting together, some of the points you're making, Michael, and just kind of how an aesthetic, political, historical Delmore could start to inform some of our present moment.
I mean, Alan, do you have something to add?
Well, I was going
to try to bring Alan in.
I'm sorry?
Do you have something to add?
You're right about that dissident communism coming back to life. Obviously, the figure of C.L.R. James is very important. You have to remember that he was completely unknown when he came here. Even when he published the Black Jacobins, it got very little attention back then. Now it's seen as a monumental work, but he's now a major figure in cultural studies. He's taught regularly and discussed regularly. And I noticed, I just read that book about Marx in America by Hartman, Andrew Hartman. It's just come out from the University of Chicago, 600 pages. He's associated somewhat with Jacobin magazine. But you see, Raya Dunevskaya and her concept of freedom is very important in the thinking of that book and all the way through. And a number of very figures that used to be minor are sort of brought to the fore. And I would say that Jacobin, which is the main sort of younger left magazine that I follow, has that kind of breadth. It could be present maybe in an N+1 on some of the other publications, but I find it especially in Jacobin. At the same time, I don't know whether you guys are like active in the current movement, especially around Palestine, but there's still some of that old Stalinist thinking present. I don't know whether you guys go to the demonstrations and see the slogans. That's not quite eliminated. It always seems to come back. And I think that a lot of ideas from the past are reworked in the present, and it helps to have a historical perspective to deal with them.
What would a Stalinist position on Palestine be? I'm just curious.
Well, it's that simplified reductionism. I mean, I think a group like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which originally was kind of third worldist, but they admire North Korea very much and so on.
Oh,
they kind of want to simplify things. If you're for resistance, then you have to be for Hamas. They're the same thing. That kind of, if you raise some question about it, can you be for armed resistance but not agree with that particular ideological perspective? Are you there for a traitor or what's going on? That kind of oversimplified reductionism is not gone. And I think that the communist tradition is a way of finding some continuity and a more pluralistic perspective that we need.
Yeah, I mean, we're dues paying members to DSA and support the kind of way in which DSA has been reborn in the last 10 or so years, 10, 12 years now. And I think, DSA is a place where there's a lot of different strains of thinking and a lot of disagreements, and it tends to be pretty open-minded. It also can be sometimes a little bit like, it's hard to reduce it down to one particular thing, and everyone's got their little caucus and that kind of thing too. But yeah, I think that's probably, and Jacobin obviously is very close to DSA. And that's probably the case with what Jacobin is up to. I think that, it is definitely true that there's a lot of very reductive thinking. There can be a very black and white friend enemy distinction being made that resembles some of the the horrible traits of the earlier period, the Stalinist period. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and always kind of a challenge, I think, for political activism to maintain open-minded sensibilities, free discussion, being willing to entertain heterodox positions, and yet also have some of that backbone and spirit of resistance that's required.
I know the point I wanted to make, but forgot to. The reason I brought up the avant-garde in cultural, if you look at Partisan Review, it was totally oriented towards high culture.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the important things about the avant-garde is popular culture, comic books, bad plays, camp stuff. If you look at Nadja, the surrealists, they loved it. They would go into all these. So in a sense, if you had to compare Partisan Review in terms of their taste in sort of culture and politics, people have compared it to the Frankfurt School in the 50s or something like that. That Adorno is again a lover of Proust and high culture and so forth, but he's not really down on any of the popular arts, certainly not in music, but in others, and they were in that direction too. And you look at Delmore and you say, this is a guy, who collects baseball cards, loves the Giants, if he's almost the perfect candidate to start writing about pop culture, but somehow the milieu around Partisan View was just not favorable to that, at least in the 30s and 40s. Eventually they got Robert Warshaw to write about film and, some of the popular culture, but not in an especially celebratory way, So that's the road down which we can see Delmore walking, but which he didn't, I think.
Well, yeah, you're exactly right, because he loved Pogo, that comic strip, and he always said that the guy who did Pogo had to have been influenced by Joyce, and Delmore wrote about Marilyn Monroe. I mean, this was a guy who would go to 2 or 3 movies a night, if possible. I mean, he loved the movies. He loved pop culture. He wrote an essay about the Classics Illustrated comic books from the 50s. I mean, that's sort of like and it's interesting that, Philip, that you bring that avant-garde strain up, because he does kind of fit right in there in a way. He does. And I think that's what, when he was talking about Joyce or Eliot versus Joyce, you're talking about those kind of 2 strains, and why he loved Finnegan's Wake so much, because the Partisan Review crowd really didn't valorize Finnegan's Wake. They were really like commercial success was very important. And avant-garde writers or works that were difficult, like Finnegan's Wake, or or it would take a bit of effort to try to go to the work where they shied away from or they disdained. And I think that in a lot of ways he stuck with Partisan Review because he liked the prestige of it, and he liked the ability to be the poetry editor and to bring in new poets, and sort of like that position that it gave him in the community, because sort of when he left Partisan Review, in a sense, that's when people start ignoring him. Or, I mean, for example, like Berryman was a great friend of his, but as Delmore's reputation started to decline, he sort of jumped ship and went to the Saul Bellow camp, and became a great friend of Saul Bellow. And sometimes I think about that and I wonder, is that sort of like, does that symbolic of how when Delmore moves from the Partisan Review and tries to stand more on his own, because of that avant-garde taste, is he just sort of like, ignored as a result?
Yeah, the other thing about Partisan Review is post-war, they were into Kessler, Saloni, and Moravia and so forth, which is not high modernism at all. It suddenly becomes European if it's European, it's fine, rather than a commitment to certainly experimental modernism that you find in the 30s. So, well, let's sort of everybody make a last comment of one sort or another, and then I think we will all go out and have brunch or something, or whatever one does. Well, on the East Coast, it wouldn't be. You'll all be having dinner or something.
I'll just say that this is a pretty inspiring discussion to me, because I see there's so much more that can be done with Delmore, and I think he'll be seen in newer ways. When I did do that essay and the one that's going to be published, I thought I read everything that was out there, and it wasn't that stimulating, and it did seem like maybe Delmore was at a dead end. But from this conversation, especially David's point about about the revival of Genesis and what that represents, I think that's all quite stimulating. So even though I'm retired, I'm thinking now, gee, if I were teaching, I think I would definitely emphasize Delmore.
I like his Season in Hell translation, which is very inaccurate, but he sort of embodies Rimbaud in a way that other translators don't. I mean, he got killed for terrible mistranslations, but at times the voice really comes alive. So I mean, I think there's so much, and the Coriolanus thing is like insane, is bonkers. So well, thanks everybody. It was a pleasure. I'm sorry Roy couldn't come in and do a dream song for us, but we will go back to our books and look at Delmore.
Okay, and let's try to keep the conversation going through correspondence, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.
That would be fun. Thank
Red
you.
May audience, Michael,
Right.
Alan, Philip.
Oh, I should make a last thing. And, tomorrow night, if you're in Seattle, go to the Beacon at 5 p.m. for How It Happened Here.
And don't forget to donate to Red May.
Donate to Red May. I always forget that. All right.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah,
Of course,
thank you
Michael.
all for
Great
coming.
to hear from you.
Yeah.